Our next speaker will be Carol Evans, formerly from the BLM.
This is what putting into practice all the things that Sherm Swanson just talked about looks like after about 2.5 decades on Maggie Creek on your right and Susie Creek on your left. The changes that you saw on Maggie and Susie Creek were the result of managed livestock grazing for riparian recovery on these two streams from Northeastern Nevada. Sherm Jensen with Whitehorse Associates, Gregg, Simonds, and Eric Sant with Open Range Consultants, and Kirk Fesenmyer with Trout Unlimited helped us understand some of these changes at big scales with the use of remote sensing techniques in these basins as well. In my opinion, this managing livestock grazing for riparian recovery sets into motion a powerful chain reaction of events that starts with getting a riparian response, which can attract beaver and which can ultimately result in rehiding landscapes over time. And it's a story for me that just keeps unfolding with twists and turns over time. All this work started with many partners sharing a common vision to restore habitat or improve habitat for Lahontan cutthroat trout in the Maggie and Susie Creek basins in northeastern Nevada, located just north of Carlin, Nevada. Lahontan cutthroat trout are a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. The red in the Maggie Basin is approximately the current distribution of cutthroat. Susie Creek is identified as a reintroduction stream. You'll notice that these are big basins. Collectively, they cover about 600 square miles with mixed public and private lands, public in yellow and private in white. There was a lot of partners have been working for a lot of years since the early 90s to improve habitat conditions for cutthroat in these two basins, but I want to focus on 3 areas because these areas intercept the stream valleys where my story takes place. These 3 areas are the Maggie Creek Watershed Restoration Area, the Susie Creek Riparian Pasture, and private lands owned by Maggie Creek Ranch. Don't read all the details on this slide. I just want to leave you with the impression that there was a lot of different prescriptive grazing strategies applied within these 3 areas over a 10 to 25 year period. Only one of the 10 different types of strategies that I'm showing here was exclusion, and in that case, the prescription was basically not to have any grazing. Although there was many variations in the type of grazing strategies that were applied, all these areas had a few things in common. They all started with basically unmanaged grazing, or the way I like to think about it is the plants in this case could just never get ahead of the grazing, more impact than recovery. With the changes, all the systems had some time that plants could grow either during a season or part of a season or another season altogether, but the result of that is over time you get more recovery than impact. And probably the most important thing that all these had was the dedication and commitment of the people who had to make it work on the ground. This is Dan Gralian and the TS Ranch crew. They moved the cows made sure the cows were in the right place at the right time in the Maggie Creek Restoration Area for 25 years. And the lower slide is John Griggs, manager of the Maggie Creek Ranch. He's been just an incredible partner to many of us working on collaborative watershed projects in both the Susie and Maggie basins for more than 20 years. This is a picture of Susie Creek taken in 1992. And many of you are familiar with this progression of channel states. Sherm Swanson just talked about it a few minutes ago. It was initially developed by Sherm Jensen with Whitehorse Associates. And the idea is that certain conditions in a watershed can set the system up to become a gully. Once it becomes a gully, often go through a period of widening. And then if management permits, a new functional floodplain can develop down in that gully over time. Well, the thing about Susie Creek at this time, it was stuck in what Sherm Jensen calls State 4, or a blown out gully. Over time, Sherm Jensen started to add some states to his channel classification system, and one of the states that he added was ponded, and that's where beaver start to pond up water and sediment and can actually start to find a way through managed grazing and beaver coming in to find a way out of that gully. On Susie and Maggie Creeks, I believe that is what happened, and I'll try to show you some examples of that. This is Maggie Creek. You saw that picture at the beginning in 1980. It was what Sherm Jensen calls a blown-out gully at the time, with pretty much season-long grazing. We started changing things with the Maggie Creek Watershed Restoration Project in '92. This is the one exclusion area that I referenced. I'm going to show it because it's a good series of pictures so you can understand the process. The process is unfolded similarly in all the pastures, regardless if it was an exclusion area or a grazed area. So after a couple years, we start to get a functional floodplain developing in this inset. It's an inset functional floodplain developing in this blown-out gully. Over time, actually not much time, the willows came in, which they do in Nevada. You change the grazing a little bit and you'll get willows. When you get willows in Nevada, you get beaver, not far behind. And by 2000, beaver found this area. By 2006, they were abundant in the area. And by 2008, they started to change the plant communities. We're starting to see the willows drown out here and being replaced by obligate wetland species like some of the sedges and cattails. And by 2015, the area was pretty much a cattail marsh. The willows were gone and the beaver were gone because they needed the willows. But the point I want to make here is that this is year 4 of a severe drought, and these dams can have such an impact on the landscape for a long period of time, even after they're no longer active. And here it was holding up and impounding that water during year 4, one of the most severe droughts most of us have seen in this area. And by 2017, this was clearly the ponded state described by Sherm Jensen. And you can see in the corner of the photo there, you can see sagebrush, like right up against the obligate cattails. The site is becoming incredibly wet up to that older terrace. Sometimes you need to blow out a gully so the beaver can do their thing and impound water and sediment. This is downstream, another pasture in the Maggie Creek Restoration Area. This had been grazed primarily during the spring for many years, but that was enough to get the floodplain to start to function and recover down in this inset floodplain. The effect of that is when the big floods come through, which they did in 2006 and 2017, the water was forced into the terrace, and it's effectively widening out this gully. Beaver had established in there many times over the years, but because the energy had been so concentrated, they were basically blown out of the gully or washed out. But as this thing gets wider, pretty soon I think they'll start to take hold. You can see in 2017 they were right back in there trying to do their thing. Well, one important clue here is this cut bank profile has a rich organic layer, and so we know that was ponded at one time, and that's where the system is trying to go. Further upstream in another grazed pasture, the Maggie Creek Restoration Area, the story's the same basically. The channel slope's a little steeper up there, so we started out with a narrower gully, but the managed grazing that took place, which was a whole bunch of different things, different seasons over time, allowed for the recovery, allowed for the widening of that gully, and it has allowed for the successful establishment of beaver so they can do their thing. And I wanted to include this picture. It's in a grazed pasture, the coyote pasture, the one I just showed you, because in an area where the slope is flat, the recovery is there's really no discernible differences here and in the downstream exclusion area pasture. This is a picture from Maggie Creek Ranch, private lands. This is a private field where John Griggs holds his cattle in the spring as they move north, holds them back in here in the fall as they come home at the end of the season. This was the first year that I ever tried to take an old picture in this area. So the old picture is up at the top, 1980. You can see that cut bank, and you can see pretty dry upland forage on top of the terrace. Well, the red circle is where that 1980 picture was taken. I couldn't get there. I tried really hard. I went over my chest waders several times, and I finally gave up and crawled up on the rocks and took the pictures from the rocks where it was dry. It was incredibly wet and deep in there, incredibly wet. So Susie Creek, when we started to change things, is this stuck as a blown out gully. This was in 1991, part of the first time that I started to see it. And although this picture was taken in April. It was a dry year, but we really had no mesic vegetation, very little mesic vegetation on the floodplain. And one thing I want to point out, the height of these cut banks to the first bit of mesic vegetation was 18 to 20 feet at that time. So we changed things. We got the Susie Creek Riparian pasture built with Maggie Creek Ranch in the fall of 1991. Started to change things to spring and fall, sometimes both in the same year, grazing. Started to get the great riparian recovery, started to get a little functional riparian area down in this broadened out gully. But as in many other places, the willows came in. And once the willows came in, the beaver weren't far behind. They created some beautiful wetlands. But Susie Creek's story unfolded a little bit differently than Maggie Creek. The system just does not hold the water. It's a smaller watershed, but I think more importantly, it's got very sandy substrates. And so the Cattail Marsh did follow the beaver dams and the willow wetlands, but it didn't last. And by 2012, excuse me, I hit the wrong button. By 2012, we were down here, and I wanted so much to get cutthroat back in this system. I wanted this to be a narrow, deep channel, a Rosganee channel in a wet meadow setting, and get some good habitat for trout. But by 2016, I started to realize that was not happening. Although we did get a single thread channel with a little bit of a bend in it, which is a good thing, that channel is full of sediment, and there's a lot of facultative or upland species on that floodplain. By 2017, I think I started to realize the process was a little differently here. It's still the same thing. I think we're still filling the gully. It's just that this sandy soil and this smaller watershed works a little differently. But you'll notice the height of this cut bank down to the first mesic vegetation on the floodplain now is only about 4 feet. And so we're filling up the gully with sand. And the other potentially important part of the story is there's lots of willows, and they're going to grow again. They're starting to grow again. And so maybe we'll start the whole cycle over at a higher elevation over time. This is interesting. Further down on Susie Creek, the beaver are doing their thing of storing up the sediment, stockpiling it up, and filling up the gullies. The water runs out in this area, so the beaver don't stay as long, but they're still able to trap the sediment. There is some spots on Susie Creek where the beaver and the wetlands have been in there for a long time. I think it's due to the slope, so the water is not backing up and drowning out the willows. But the beaver have been pretty stable in here since 2003 in this location. My final slide on Susie Creek is not really about beaver, although they did come into this site. It's about this concept of more recovery than impact. And with this system, which is on Maggie Creek Ranch private lands, hot season grazing can occur as much as every other year. And that can be a little hard to climb out of initially, which it was. We saw a lot of impact early on. But over time, the recovery gets ahead of the impact, which is what happened here. Remote sensing offers a neat way to look at all these changes at a big scale. This is work by Gregg Simonds and Eric Sant with Open Range Consulting. They use color IR photography to document changes in the Maggie Creek restoration area. With color IR, the riparian vegetation shows up as red, and in that area they were able to show an increase in over 500 acres. Sherm Jensen had also done some more work in the Maggie Basin. He showed between 2006 and 2010 an increase in the beaver dams. Active beaver dams went from 107 to 271, and area of ponded water increased by 9 miles. Shows you how prolific beaver can be. And finally, this is work by Kurt Fesenmyer in the Susie Creek Basin, showing increases in response to the management of over 100 acres of riparian vegetation. The beaver dams went from 0 to 139. Open water increased by 20 acres, and length of wetted stream increased by 3 miles. There's also information below the surface that shows us the increase in the water storage. You saw these series of changes on Maggie Creek. There's a shallow well that Newmont Mining Corporation has in the area. This shows an increase in about 2 to 3 feet of shallow groundwater storage over the period that we implemented the changes in management. And it's also stayed high during some severe drought periods. This is one of my favorite pictures. It was taken from a helicopter in April of 2012. there's a couple of neat things here. There was water during a severe drought year. The restored riparian area partially stopped a fire in 2007. But most importantly, we have built a great big sponge in this blown-out gully. So if you have a sponge, what's the best thing to do with a sponge is hydrate it, right? And we did that in a major flood event in spring of 2017. By the time I went back out there in the fall, we had an incredible sponge. Sage grouse need to be in this story somewhere, right? So I think they are. So I think as the water table comes up and gets close to these terraces, it brings a mesic edge and mesic forbs along with it, many of which are important for sage grouse broods. In summary, I think managing livestock grazing for riparian recovery can set into motion a very ecologically powerful chain reaction of events, including a riparian response, beaver coming in, and all this having the effect of rehydrating landscapes over time. However, we will never get to managing livestock grazing if we can't agree on these two things, and this is the most important. Sharing a common vision, PFC is a fantastic way to accomplish that, and then being able to work together. And fortunately, our next speaker is John Gregg, who has been inspiring many of us to work together and showing us how to work together for more than 20 years in both the Maggie and Susie basins. Lastly, thank you to the individuals and entities that have made it possible for me to continue to work on these streams. I guess we have time for questions, Hannah? Okay. Yes. Okay. The question concerns whether cattle had access to water during the periods that we were applying some of the prescriptive management. And yes, they did. Either it could have been off-site, or when they were they were in the pasture for a certain season of use, and water was available to them during that time. So if they were not there during the hot season and they were somewhere else, they would have to have water somewhere else during that hot season. But when they were in the pasture, the water was just available in the stream to them at that time. One more question? Go ahead. You just wait for the next talk. You're going to hear it from the expert, if that's okay. The question was how to establish the relationship with the ranchers, and fortunately our next speaker is a great person to talk about this.